Hey students, welcome back for Unit 3, Lesson 4. This is Adolescence, and here we will talk about the key features in cognitive and social development, all this and that in adolescence. So, adolescence, what is it? It's a time period that is defined by puberty, entering into puberty. So this is that transition from childhood into adulthood where you learn to be independent. You are in adolescence right now, which means you have crossed over into puberty. This is a time of sexual maturation when a person becomes capable of reproducing. It is marked by the development of both primary and secondary sex characteristics, primary being those that are directly involved in reproduction, so depending on your sex, which will tell us which one you have. And secondary characteristics include things like hair under the arms, hair in new places, development of breasts and hips for females, and the stuff that attracts other people to that individual. Onset of puberty begins at different rates for either sex, if you're female or male. So onset of puberty for females is 9.5 to 12 years old, whereas for males is 11 to 13. And that's when they hit their growth spurts. So girls are usually done growing by the time they reach 8th grade, and boys may hit another one in high school. I've seen it happen all the time. That's onset by your pituitary gland. Remember, that's responsible for the growth of your bodies. And these onset of puberty at different rates is a little bit problematic for females, especially if they developed young, like if there are secondary sex characteristics like breasts and hips develop when they're 11 years old, and yet they're incapable of making cognitive advanced decisions. They might find themselves in trouble and making adult decisions because the rest of the world perceives them as that way. They might look older than what they actually are. Whereas for boys, it works like if they have puberty that comes on early and say by 8th grade, they're grown, they might be a better athlete when they're younger than when they are like by sophomore or junior year. So dangers in both, but it is what it is, and we all have different maturational readiness rates. One of the interesting features of adolescence is that we expect to have mature prefrontal cortex reasoning, but this is just not the case. If you've ever found yourself thinking irrationally or impulsively, it is because your prefrontal cortex is not fully developed. This is the part of our brain that's responsible for impulse control, setting priorities. Maybe you're a procrastinator. Well, guess what? It's typical for your age group. Our prefrontal cortex is not developed until we're in our mid-20s. Therefore, we are guided more by emotion than we are by logic and planning. There's also evidence that the frontal cortex delays the inability to delay gratification. And so we might act on impulse. We want what we want when we want it. And if we're in adolescence, we might make decisions that are not based on sound logical reasoning. Like we might pick up a cigarette. We might, dabble in some of the things that we're not supposed to do when we know we're not supposed to do it. We might do things like put ourselves in harm's way and just do stupid stuff because we're kids. That's what happens. We learn from those experiences, and hopefully by the time we've reached adulthood, we don't endanger ourselves in those ways. One of Jean Piaget's stages of development that he would say that you and I are in right now is formal operations. And unfortunately, this is one of the places where Piaget gets some criticism because it's not fully thought out, I suppose. So Piaget's stage 4 is when we are able to think abstractly, consider hypotheticals and possibilities. Well, in adolescence, we're not always up there. We're not always thinking about abstractly and possibilities. What we are doing for sure, according to Erik Erikson and his wife, who theorized with him, is identity formation. And I see this happen all the time in high school in my position. I see most of you when you're sophomores, but I have a lot of students who enter high school, in one category, and by the end of high school, they have, completely transformed, which is cool. It's the way it's supposed to be. But in stage 5 of what Erikson calls his psychosocial stages of development, we are experiencing identity versus role confusion. And so adolescents may seek to abandon the carefree, irresponsible, and impulsiveness of childhood and try on these different roles in adulthood that they are experimenting with. So we need to develop purposeful, planned, and responsible behaviors of adulthood. Therefore, we can transition into being healthy adults. So we're trying on different roles, different identities. And you might find this like in the choices that people make when they're dating. Like they might choose one characteristic over another, and then a year later they're seeking something different out. That's because they're bouncing ideas off of one another. But the important part about this stage is that Erik Erikson says that we've advanced through these different stages throughout our ages, and we come across times of crisis. And the crisis for adolescence is learning to form who we are. Who are we going to be? And if successful, if we work out our identity successfully, then we're going to be healthy, confident. And if not, then it may be role confusion, low self-esteem, unstable, or socially withdrawn. So this happens in adolescence. Like I said, I see it a lot. Another theorist was a man named James Marcia, and his 4 categories of identity crisis. Identity formation and identity crisis, according to Marcia, is in who am I going to be? And I'll have more information, of course, on this in class. But Marcia said we go through these different identity statuses, and each status is a different level of us finding out who we are. And I think of high school seniors in this identity crisis. What am I going to do with the rest of my life? When we get to high school senior status, we have to make decisions about who we are going to become. Well, at a very early age, especially, our prefrontal cortex still is developing. So how do we equip ourselves to handle these big, complex decisions? Well, sometimes we don't, depending upon where we are in the status. So Marcia says we come across these crises, these decisions that have to be made, and sometimes we're successful with answering those crises, and sometimes we're not. And if we're not, we might be playing video games for a long time. Okay, those are some key features of adolescence, including your physical development and also your social and cognitive development. Cognitive development is in abstract thinking, formal operations, and social development includes Erikson and Marcia's ideas about who you are and the role you're going to play in your life.